Citizens Advisory Council. Jim served as a member of the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve Citizens Advisory Council and the Board of Directors. The Weber's Nature books include Nature Watch Austin, Guide to the Seasons in Urban Wildland, Nature Watch Big Bend, a seasonal guide, Native Host Plants for Texas Butterflies, a field guide. Here's the butterfly book. Okay. And their new one is the Native Host Plants for Texas Moths. And we have those here signed for sale. And I think they're gone.
Butterflies are sold out.
Oh, we sold your butterfly books.
Can you hear us yet?
I can hear them just fine through your computer, just fine.
Okay. So we can hear you on Zoom, but
Okay.
Zoom folks,
yeah, just unplug it.
but Zoom folks can hear just fine.
Okay.
Okay, so I think
So
we're good.
Zoom can hear you. It's just my computer can't hear you.
When
So
you're ready to share your screen with your presentation, go ahead.
Okay.
All righty.
All right, we'll do
all
that.
right, I'm fixing to mute me.
Participants.
How's that?
Yep. Yep.
Participants.
Looks good.
You guys might want to gather around these people.
You might want to turn the lights out in the room or most of them.
Yeah, ends up looking better in low light.
Or if you can turn the lights out in the front near the screen, that's helpful. There you go. Okay, all right, I think we're ready to go then. We appreciate you having us here tonight. We're going to talk to you a little bit about native host plants for both Texas butterflies and moths. And we got the idea for our books because, like many people, we're interested in a lot of things in nature. And we were always looking at plant books and seeing that it's a host for something. And then we'd have to go to the butterfly or the moth book and see what that little creature looked like, or we would start with a butterfly or a moth and it would just say grasses or lilies or lagoons. So we wanted to do the research, and Jim did a lot of this research to verify what the associations are between certain species of butterflies and their host plants and certain species of moths. So what we're going to talk to you about today, the first few slides will be repeat, I'm sure, for most of you. We'll talk a little bit about the habitat and plant diversity of Texas because that's important to the distribution of these insects. Why natives are important. We always like the chance to go through why they're important and what are native host plants versus native nectar plants. We'll talk a little bit about the lifestyle of Lepidoptera, which is the order of insects that includes butterflies and moths, and talk about some general differences between them. Well, then I'll turn it over to Jim, and he's going to go through some of the host plant species accounts, the different plants and the butterflies and moths that use them. And then he'll turn it back to me, and we'll say a little bit about gardening for Lepidoptera, how you can also use other attractants to see what butterflies and moths may be in your yard. And then because they're a little more elusive, we'll share some of our techniques for how we photograph moths. So as we all know, there are several different versions of the ecoregions of Texas, but this is the Gould version. Texas is a large state, second only in land area to Alaska. This divides Texas into 10 different natural areas that vary in climate and landscapes, and that's why we have so much habitat diversity. And within those habitats, we also have topographic diversity. In West Texas, as an example, there's 91 mountain peaks a mile or more high, and then we go all the way down to the coast, which of course is at sea level. We're also at a transition zone. I don't think a lot of people realize this. that a lot of the species that are northernmost have their southernmost range here, and those that are southernmost have their northernmost range here, and those ranges overlap. And the same goes for things that are more common in the eastern part of the US versus the western part of the US. And as we know, and was mentioned just a little earlier, rainfall can average anywhere from 8 to 56 inches. It sounds like you all got a 1/4 inch. I think we got close to 2 inches at our house just yesterday. We needed it. So the diversity of plants in Texas is very high. In fact, it's got one of the highest number of plant taxa, which includes species, subspecies, variations, et cetera, at 6,000, divided into more than 220 families. And that's second only to the state of California. As far as butterflies and moths are concerned, there are about 500 species of known butterflies here in Texas and about 4,700 moth species. And in fact, there are so many moth species that not all of them have been identified, and therefore not all of their host plant associations have been identified, and they're still being discovered today. The butterflies and moths do use many different types of plants as host plants, including, of course, tree shrubs, wildflowers, vines, and grasses. We chose, for the most part, to stay away from grasses. That's probably a whole book in and of itself that I'm not sure either of us really want to tackle.
We chickened out.
We did. I'm saying it the nice way. And even there are some moth species that their caterpillars feed on lichen and algae, which is pretty interesting. We didn't include those in our books either, but that's something that we came across. But because of the plant diversity in Texas and the way that plants are distributed, they also are the principal factor for how butterfly and moths are distributed in the state of Texas. It makes a lot of sense. You go where the food is, where these species can reproduce. So of course, I'm preaching to the choir here, why natives? I like to point out when we do talk to people about it, how it keeps an ecosystem healthy, helps us reclaim land, preserve and produce soil, protects our waterways from erosion. Native plants are already adapted, naturally hardy, relatively disease-free. We've had a lot more luck in growing native plants than non-native plants, that's for sure. And they create the habitat, the natural connections to local insects, birds, and other wildlife. And of course, even if none of that matters to some people, they are beautiful reminders of our natural heritage here in Texas. So why not non-natives? We get this question a lot, so we thought we'd answer it head on. And by the way, the government defines non-native as a plant or animal living or growing in a place that is not the region where it naturally lives and grows. The reason non-natives are really a problem is because they're frequently invasive and they often outcompete the native plants. They can grow taller, faster, wider. They can shade out natives. They could stay green later in the season or leaf out sooner in the spring. They kind of change the structure of our ecosystems by altering hydrology and disrupt nutrient cycles. In other words, if we put a plant in and replace a native one that was used by certain insects in their life cycle, and we take that out and we get rid of it and we replace it with something from Japan or China or France, we disrupt that nutrient cycle and that particular species may no longer cease to exist. Aside from those reasons, we also ran across the fact that the US Environmental Protection Agency had these statistics about having non-native plants, including lawns. And they said lawns and gardens are sprayed with over 90 million pounds of insecticides and herbicides annually, which of course poison our lands and waters. Mowers, edgers, and blowers emit 27 million tons of air pollutants each year, not to mention the noise pollution that they cause. And that we squander potable water. We use potable water to water our non-native lawns. And we use about 9 billion gallons per day. So I think we could probably find better uses for that water. Just one more point to make, that roughly 42 of endangered and threatened species in the US are detrimentally affected by non-natives, and 18% of those have become endangered directly as a result of non-natives. On the left, it shows you that really the chance for us to stop biological invasion is in the front when we can prevent some from coming here. But if not, we can try to eradicate or contain or even control. But if we get to the point where we can't do that, then they end up dominating the ecosystem. I've listed just a few things on the right that are the top natives to avoid and replace, and it sounds like the NICE program has some excellent suggestions for native alternatives, which is really terrific. I also liked the comic strip I came across a while back. The two women are on one side of the fence, and you can see somebody's feet, their neighbor, on the other side of the fence, and the woman says, sure, it's a bit of an invasive plant, but I haven't gotten any complaints from the neighbors. All right, so let's get a little more specific here. Let's stop talking generalities. What are host plants versus nectar plants? These are not the same terms. In fact, the host plant is the one that the female butterflies and moths deposit their eggs upon. And these are the plants that provide food for their caterpillars. Many butterfly and moth species actually require specific species of host plants. They can't use just anything. Nectar plants, on the other hand, are the food sources for the adult butterflies and moths. The flowers that they prefer usually are ones that have ample nectar, or maybe they have a large landing platform where the insect, like the butterfly or the moth, can land and nectar at a flat platform. The nectar source selection and the plants they use for that is much less specific, and it's typically not the host plant, but in some cases, they actually still use the host plant. So let's talk a little bit about some general things between butterflies and moths. In terms of their antennae, butterflies generally have an antenna with a little small club at the end, like a thin thread-like antenna with a club at the end, whereas moths, their antennae are usually feathery or sawtooth or thread-like without a club at the end. Butterflies tend to have their wings folded vertically over their abdomen when they're at rest, whereas moths tend to fold them in a tent-like fashion, often hiding their abdomen, although some of them fold them open and spread them open flat. Butterflies are typically diurnal, meaning they are in day flyers, but some are also what's called crepuscular, which means they tend to fly at dawn or at dusk. Moths are typically nocturnal, flying at night, but we'll show you some examples of some that are day flyers. The biggest difference probably is that butterflies form a chrysalis in the pupal stage, which is the stage between the caterpillar and the adult, whereas moths typically form a cocoon. It's interesting to note, and I referred to the numbers, at least in Texas, a few slides ago, that moth species typically outnumber butterfly species by almost 15 to 1. As far as chrysalises and cocoons, again, they're the pupal stages of these insects. The chrysalis for the butterfly is typically formed out in the open. The word is from the Latin, it means gold, and it often refers to some gold-like coloration on the chrysalis itself. Not all butterflies form chrysalises. Some actually pupate in plant roots, stems, or pods, and we'll show you an example of that. But a chrysalis is more of a hardened case, and it's usually attached to a surface by a combination of a silken pad spun by the caterpillar, and then the caterpillar has hooks at the tip of its abdomen, and that's where it grabs into that pad and forms that characteristic J shape. Excuse me, my throat is dry.
And on the moth side, oh, you okay?
I got it. I think so.
Okay.
On the moth side, the cocoons are what most moths create, but some actually pupate underground, and we'll show you an example of that. Cocoon is actually from French, and it typically means shell, and it's a soft but tough silk case. And it's typically camouflaged with bits of vegetation, often what the host plant is that the caterpillar has been using. And it's usually attached to twigs or somewhere in a more concealed location. The life cycle of butterflies and moths are similar. Excuse me. They both lay eggs, and they can be laid singly or in multiples depending on the species. the larva or the caterpillar will hatch and begin to feed, and often its first meal is actually the shell of the egg. It's full of protein. And then they will feed on different parts of the plants using various techniques depending on the species. But as the larva or the caterpillar grows, it sheds its skin and it goes through several phases called instars. And those instars are the phases between those two periods of molting. Most species go through about 5 instars. And that final instar is the one that pupates, in the case of a butterfly, in a chrysalis, or a case of a moth, a cocoon. The adult then emerges or it closes from that chrysalis or cocoon. And some of the adult species, especially in the moth family, never feed. All right, so now that we know a little bit more about plants, let's talk first about how do these butterflies and moths find a mate. Well, butterflies from a distance, the males and females of the same species will actually recognize each other by relative size and movement, maybe color and shape. And at close range, they actually can recognize patterns. But most importantly, the females will sense with their antennae an external hormone or pheromone that is secreted by the male. Moths, on the other hand, it's the females who release those pheromones from a gland on the tip of their abdomens. That scent is species specific, of course, just like the butterflies. It's sensed by the male, sometimes from miles away, through receptors on their antenna called sensilla. So if you look at this picture on the upper left, the little small one, you can look at the antenna there and they're very thread-like, and that's a female. The antenna on the male of the same species, and by the way, this is a Cecropia moth, is in the smaller picture on the lower left. And you can see his antennae are very fan-like, almost like coral. And the reason for that is because it's a larger surface area. He has those sensilla on his antenna, and that's what he uses to actually search for and seek out those scents that are emitted by the female. So now that they found each other and hopefully have mated, how do they find plants? Well, this is my Dr. Seuss part of the presentation. Insects that eat plants are called phytophagous. Those that eat more than one species or type of plant are called polyphagous. And those that eat only one species or type of plant are called monophagous. Most famous example of a monophagous species would be the monarch butterfly, only eating milkweed species. Polyphagous, I think a good example would be the gray hair streak, because the gray hair streak eats a lot of different plants. So what we know about how they find plants, they utilize smell and taste. They actually have taste receptors, butterflies do on their legs, and moths have taste receptors on their legs and antennae. I don't know if you've ever watched a butterfly fly low in a field or in a garden and land on a plant very, very quickly and gently, and then lift off and go to the next one and land. That's probably a female who is actually looking for and tasting to find her host plant. What we don't know is if they use visual cues like color to locate their host plants. Do they try to look for host plants that are growing in abundance so they can increase their chances of survival? Do they learn locations of where host plants are? Those are some of the things that...
Or do they remember where they ate their plant as a caterpillar?
Wouldn't that be something? I can't even remember what I had for breakfast. All right, so what we're going to do next is, I'll do this, Jim. Jim's going to take you through, since we've kind of done a little bit of an intro, he's going to take you through more of what's in the book, or the books. And what you'll find is on the left-hand side of this part of the presentation will be, much like the book, the main photo of the plant, some detailed photos on the lower section, whether that be a flower or a seed, and then a range map by county. And then on the right, for the presentation purposes, we'll give you some fun facts about the plant and or the butterfly or the moth, whereas in the book, we're describing the plant because it is a plant book, of course. And then we'll have pictures of the adult butterfly and moth and the caterpillar photo associated with it. So let me switch seats with you, Jim, and you can do the next part.
And I'm actually kind of surprised you haven't met either of our cats yet today. We do have a couple free-ranging cats in the house, and occasionally we do these. One of them gets kind of vocal and wants to come in and participate, but he's still sleeping. So maybe we'll get through it. But so we're going to first cover a few plants for butterflies that were selected out of the first host plant book. And so the first one here is kind of a little plant that's often overlooked, but very popular with black swallowtails. And it's the Dutchman's breeches. It's a little tiny plant in the rue family with most of the state, the flowers are kind of a little yellow flower, but out in the Trans-Pecos, they may have kind of a pinkish purple flower. It's a little low growing herb. Common name comes from these little two-lobed seed, kind of inflated seed pods down here in the middle picture on the bottom left. And I guess they look like Dutchman's breeches to some people from years ago. And as you can see from the map, it's pretty widespread through everything pretty much but the east and north part of the state. And we have seen black swallowtail caterpillars on these pretty regularly in the fall. Early instars for a lot of the swallow caterpillars look like bird droppings. They're little camo to protect them from getting eaten. But then as they get bigger, they get a little more colorful. And this one's got nice bands, black, green, yellow, and white. And that bottom picture is the black swallowtail caterpillar displaying what's called an osmeterium. It's a defensive structure that if it gets scared or irritated or picked up, it's going to inflate that, and it apparently emits kind of a foul smell, and a bird maybe would think ick and drop it as a result. Haven't gotten close enough to smell that. On the next one is in the nettle family. It's also a little overlooked plant, but very common, Pennsylvania pellitory. It's a little non-stinging nettle. The young plants are pretty tasty. They smell and taste like fresh cucumber, which is how it gets one of its alternate common names of cucumber weed.
Edible.
Oh yeah, and it is edible. We've tasted this stuff. It grows by the side of our house, and it's kind of tasty actually. The Red Admiral uses this, and everybody's probably seen a Red Admiral. It's pretty common brushfoot. And the larva will make a shelter in the vegetation. Early instars, they'll build little nests by tying up the leaves, and it'll overwinter as either a pupa or an adult. But we were taking pictures of this plant on the main plant shot in Zilker Gardens, and Lynn was laid on the ground. And sometimes she's doing that, taking pictures. Somebody thinks she's had a stroke or something, but nope, just taking pictures. And Red Admiral came in and laid an egg right on this little leaf here on the right-hand side while she was taking a picture of it. So we have confirmation, proof. It does happen. And we wouldn't ever give one of these presentations in the state of Texas without covering our favorite, much maligned tree from Central Texas and the Edwards Plateau, the ash juniper. It's a native tree. It's not a cedar, no matter what everybody says about it. And we really are kind of partial to them. It's can be a little invasive, sure, because we've suppressed fire over the years, and range management probably has led to a little bit of its spread as well. It's named after William Willard Ash, was an early forester in the U.S. Forest Service. The female juniper hairstreak will lay eggs on fresh foliage, maybe around the tops of these things, and they are really, the little caterpillars are really cryptic. We've got a picture of one here. You may be able to make it out, but it's in the center of the lower right shot. And it is really hard to see. We were taking pictures of that actually on a little potted juniper that was on a table. And we took some pictures, looked away for a little while, and then turned around and wanted to take a few more. And it took us about 15 minutes to re-find the thing, and it hadn't even moved. But they're very hard to find. There are two subspecies of juniper hair streaks in Texas. One is the olive hair streak, and the other one is the Siva juniper hair streak. But the Siva is more westerly distributed. The juniper or the olive juniper hair streak is more common. Century plants. Twist leaf yucca is kind of a popular plant in the hill country. We have it in our backyard. Long, narrow leaves with a little bit of a yellow-orange edge. They're straight when they're young, and they kind of twist as they get older. You could make fiber out of the leaves, and the roots have saponins in them, which is kind of a soap substitute. This is one Lynn kind of alluded to earlier, but giant skippers use this thing, and they don't just eat the leaves. They have kind of an interesting life history, and we'll have another page on that. But there are two species of giant skipper that feed on this thing, the yucca giant skipper and the Strucker's giant skipper. Both of them are found in the central Texas Edwards Plateau. So the yucca giant skipper life cycle. The adult will lay an egg on a twist leaf yucca leaf, and that's it, that nice pink thing there. Usually just by itself. Once in a while, it'll be a pair. And then the caterpillar will hatch, and it'll start eating eat the eggshell, then eat a little bit of leaf blade, and then it's going to burrow down into the crown of the yucca and feed on the root. It will make, hey, there's Sam starting to sing. It'll make a protective tent on the hole where it's dug into the crown of the plant. And it's really well camouflaged, but it's this kind of vegetation-like looking structure that sticks out of the base of the yucca. And sometimes this activity will kill the yucca, and sometimes not. It depends how big the plant is. But it's kind of hard to see. But it'll end up emerging out of the top of that tent when the time comes. But it'll chew its way down into the roots and spend the winter in the roots, pupate in the spring, and then emerge like picture number 3. And the early spring, I would say usually late March, maybe early April, it will emerge out of this tent, and then it'll live out its life here as an adult. And this is one of the butterflies that does not eat as an adult, doesn't take any nectar. Males will get moisture out of puddles and stuff, but for some chemical nutrients, but they don't feed on nectar, and the females don't feed. So they don't live very long as adults. But kind of an interesting life cycle. And another little easily overlooked plant that's utilized by a pretty cool butterfly is the swanflower, Ristolochia erecta. It's in the birthwort family, the pipevine family. The plant is, without flowering, the plant looks like a little patch of crabgrass or something. It's really easily overlooked. And if it's growing in somebody's lawn or a meadow or something, you would never find it unless it had a bloom. But these things are named after their pipevine is named after the kind of the shape of the flowers. They kind of look like an old-fashioned meerschaum pipe. Pipevine larva, pipevine swallowtail, that uses this can be either a smoky red or a dusky black. And these plants aren't very big, so a lot of times they have to go wandering around looking for another one for them to feed. So you may see the caterpillars wandering around. The adults end up being distasteful to predators by virtue of the caterpillars eating these plants that have chemicals in them that are not very tasty. So it helps the butterfly avoid getting eaten. as an adult. So now we have a few selected plants that we'll show you for moths in Texas. And there's a wide range with all the, almost 5,000 species of moths in Texas. There's a wide range of size of these things. Some of them are little tiny jobs that you kick up in the grass as you're walking around. And oh, sorry, moths. Yes, the moths. And some are about 6 inches across and look like a little bat when they're flying around your porch light. But there's a lot of variety in these. But 2 of these little moths will eat giant rain lilies, which are a really cool plant in the hill country. And we like seeing those bloom after a rain. There's sometimes one of the species blooms in the spring and another one blooms less in the fall. But these 2 moths, the Attractants and the straight line Sidosia, are 2 little guys that are kind of attractive in their own right, but easily overlooked. And also this is a good example too of they don't always just eat the leaves. And the straight line Sidosia is shown eating the seed head of the rain lily as instead of the leaves. In the evening primrose family is Mexican primrose willow. This is a really nice plant, likes kind of moist areas, upright, pretty good sized kind of shrubby plant, reddish stems, yellow flowers. Name refers to these little slender ribbed capsules. And we had some of those in the starting to form in the middle picture on the bottom. But the adult banded sphinx moth banded sphinx moth is the one that uses this, and the caterpillars are pretty vividly colored and marked, really hard to mistake them for anything else. And the adult is pretty cool too. It can be very cryptic if it has its wings folded over its abdomen, but the hind wings got some pretty amazing bright pink spots on it. But you don't always get lucky enough to see that. One of our other favorites here, and I'm sure you've seen this one planted around, Jimson weed or sacred datura. It's in the potato family, the nightshade family. It is a night bloomer, has big white trumpet-shaped flowers. They'll bloom overnight, and then by noon the next day, they're usually toast. The plant is kind of interesting too. Its extract is a little bit of a narcotic, and some of the native peoples had used that in ceremonies, which is why it got its name as sacred datura. There are a few sphinx moths, larger sphinx moths, that use this plant, and they're sometimes called hummingbird moths or hawk moths by hummingbird moth, probably because they're about the same size as hummingbirds. And the Carolina sphinx has sort of a unique relationship with this plant. Caterpillars known as tomato hornworm. So a lot of people don't like to see them in their gardens, but you just need to plant some Jimson weed in there to keep the caterpillars interested in that and not your tomatoes. But the Carolina sphinx will nectar on these big white blooms at night. It's got a really long proboscis that can get all the way down into the throat of that flower. It'll then get some pollen on its head and go move around and put that on other stamens on other flowers and pollinates this thing as it moves around getting its dinner. The pink spotted hawk moth is a similar looking pink version of that species, but does the same thing. Good looking moths and pretty good sized.
And if you don't want tomato hornworms to eat your tomatoes, plant Jimson weed nearby.
Yep, that's right. Just need more Jimson weed. Probably one of the more common plants across the state of Texas that's everywhere is honey mesquite. And a lot of different species of moths and butterflies will feed on honey mesquite. So, but in the last 120 years, this thing has increased a lot in abundance, not necessarily range, mainly due to livestock and grazing. The lining of these legumes on honey mesquite is where it gets the name honey in there. And it can be ground into a really sweet tasting flour or kind of a cornmeal kind of thing with a caramel-like flavor. And we had a friend of ours give us a bag of this stuff that the folks out in the Trans-Pecos had ground and into the little powder, and that stuff is tasty. Couple of the more spectacular moths that eat this are Heidelberg's mesquite moth and the Isle moth. The mesquite moth and the Isle moth caterpillars are also pretty interesting as well. They're have some interesting structures and markings on them. The Isle moth that we show here on the bottom left is the female version, and it's got this orangish red forewing. The male is a bright yellow forewing. Markings are similar, but the male is all yellow. And the thing to note about Isle moth caterpillars, if you see those, don't pick them up because they do have stinging hairs, and you might, after a minute or two, be sorry you did that. There are other species, like I said, that do eat this as well. Lots of things like plants in the grape family as well. This is Mustang grape. It's a great plant for the eastern half of the state and central and north. Pretty widespread. It grows some nice sized grapes. It can be a big vine. We have a lot of that growing behind the house as well. You can tell it from winter grape because the fruits are larger and the leaves are more concave shaped and almost whitish on the underside because they have this white pubescence on the underside of the leaves that the winter grape does not have. A couple of the moths we feature on this are the grape leaf skeletonizer moth. These are day flyers and night flyers. Little guys, you'd almost maybe mistake it for a wasp, but it is a moth. And then the grapevine epimenis is a good looking day flying moth, almost looks like a butterfly, really. And it'll visit blooms on Mexican plum and redbud in the springtime because that's really about the season that they're flying.
An elbow bush.
And elbowbush, that's right. The early blooming things, and it's an early season flyer. And I tell you, it's a tough one to photograph sometime. I was trying to take a picture of one at the Wildflower Center a couple years ago, and I swear it could detect the autofocus ultrasonics of the camera, and every time I tried focusing on it, it would jump on me. It's very frustrating. Along the lines of the vines and the grapes, another one that uses this is the vine sphinx, and it has a little bit of an iteration to the more common moth life cycle that was worth mentioning too. It's kind of fun. Of course, the adult lays an egg on the leaf of the grape or maybe on a tendril. The larval may lack this anal horn at the end, especially towards the latter instars. And they kind of retract their heads when they're afraid or get disturbed. So they look kind of weird at the top end of this caterpillar picture, the little green hot dog that they are. And then it'll actually, these things pupate underground. They don't do a cocoon. They just dig a little hole into some loose soil and make a little chamber and turn into a pupa down there and spend the winter. So these guys will emerge in April or May, or maybe June to October, depending on the brood. And they just crawl right up out of the ground as an adult, which is the funniest thing. That picture of it emerging, number 4, I guess it is or 3 to, anyway, the little guy emerging is not our picture, but it just looks so cute. I couldn't resist showing that. The bottom picture is ours on the back porch at our house. We have a lot of these around. But they're nectar feeders, but they also will like night blooming plants like Jimson weed and probably also the little guy we have out front, another little night bloomer.
Berlander's trumpets.
That's right. Thanks.
The only other point I just want to make on this is that many species of sphinx moths pupate underground rather than forming a cocoon.
Cool.
All right, so let me take back over. We'll talk a little bit about gardening for Lepidoptera. So just some general rules. I'm sure you all are pretty experienced at doing this, but we always try to get the message across because it depends on what group we're talking to. But plant natives because they are the true hosts for the insects and they require less work on our part. Don't use pesticides. They're all equal to opportunity killers. You know, we've noticed our neighbors, if they do the fogging for mosquitoes, we get less things in our yard, not just mosquitoes. Use drip irrigation to try and be water efficient while the plants are getting established. Plant the species in clusters. This provides what's called flower constancy to insects. And what that means is that an insect has to work a lot less hard to find a lot of nectar in a small area. So that's why planting in clusters is important. You can plant a variety of bloom types, different colors, different shapes, things that are sequential bloomers that bloom spring to fall, things that are night bloomers, like the datura. Of course, include both the host and nectar plants to feed both phases of the life cycle, and plan for density. In addition to planting species in clusters, which provides that flower constancy, it also suppresses the growth of weeds or unwanted species. And putting similar plants together means you can meet their needs better, whether it be sunshade, different water requirements, soil, or height. And embrace imperfection. I want to really make that point. Doing less benefits wildlife. And what do I mean by that? Well, as far as maintaining a garden, you really should fuss as little as possible. We tend to want to do a lot of raking and blowing and cutting and pruning and digging and deadheading and working the soil. And if you do that, you may actually damage what you work so hard to attract. Many things over winter and rolled up in a leaf, in the leaf litter, or maybe just under an inch or so of soil, or maybe some late, some moth species that have a couple of life cycles in spring and then in the fall are eating seed heads or dead heads that you want to remove. Leave them if you can as much as possible. And if it's especially important to leave the leaves. Many pupa exist in those leaves, not just of butterflies and moths, but other really important pollinators. If you can't just leave them, you could decide, well, I'm going to gently rake them to a large circular area under a tree or triangular areas between groups of plants, or use them as natural mulch under your shrub beds, etc. And just be very careful when you do a cutback. We don't cut back usually until late February, early March, when things are actually starting to wake up again, because seed heads are food for wildlife. And you want to make sure you leave it there as long as you possibly can. And you also have to be careful because there may be some overwintering larvae or pupa. There may be some chrysalises or cocoons there that if you aren't careful and don't inspect things, you may end up actually getting rid of them. I have this list of native plant sources for Texas. It's very general. I noticed your nice brochure goes through that terrifically, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Other attractants in gardening. We mentioned this a little bit earlier that some species don't actually nectar, but they actually will get moisture, nutrients from moisture. They'll get minerals, etc. Some species will actually sip nectar or dew or tree sap, but there's ways that you can help to provide these alternate ways of eating or getting nutrients for these insects. One is by giving a puddling area in your garden. And you can do that by just having an area, whether it be a dish or a cordoned off area or something that you put rocks around to define it. And it's just filled with sand or with crushed granite, and keep it damp, not soaking wet, not dry, but keep it damp, and you'll end up having butterflies and moths come and puddle to it and get nutrients and minerals out of that. You can also create what's called a butterfly bait and create a bait station. You create this bait, and if you look on the internet, there's a million recipes, but basically you just take any kind of mixture of bananas, beer, molasses, brown sugar, overripe fruit juice, put it in a blender, blend it up really well, and put it in a glass container uncovered in a hot area of your house like your garage. Let it sit there for a few days to a week and ferment. And then you can take it and you can actually pour it into a dish and put it out in the garden, or you can paint it on sections of tree trunks. This is especially fun to do with kids. You can paint the tree trunks along the trail at their height, maybe 4 feet or so. And then at night, go out with flashlights and walk the trail and see what may be actually nectaring on your sugar trail. Another thing you can do to see what's in your yard, or even just to take photographs of things, and we do this fairly often, is black lighting. And what you do is you create a light trap by hanging a black light or a mercury vapor light in front of a white sheet. You turn it on at dusk and leave it on till dawn. You'll attract a lot of things to it because moths are what's called positively phototactic, or attracted to certain wavelengths of light. We usually hang a black light and a mercury vapor light together because that covers a wide range of wavelengths. And you'll get other things too, like stick insects and antlions, katydids, etc. But you never know. It's one way to know what's really lurking in your yard when you're sleeping. Another thing that we do is that we can gather moth cocoons in the wild where it's permitted, or we can buy them from or trade them from members of, say, the Austin Butterfly Forum or other reputable sources. We'll get them and we'll put them in clean, empty Chinese food containers, and then we'll put them in the crisper drawer of our refrigerator. And usually about this time of year is when we get them. We keep them in the refrigerator until early March. Then we take them out and put them in the screen cages you see on the lower left. And then by springtime, they end up emerging, the moths do, and they're in the cage. And what we do is we want to photograph them. You could see our 2 cats there, Sam and Jessie, trying to help us. They're inside and the moth is outside, and that's a Cecropia moth. So what we do to actually photograph them is once they emerge and they've had maybe a day to pump fluid into their wings and expand and be in their prime form, we'll then put them in a small container in the refrigerator for about a half an hour just to get them quiet. It slows them down when they're colder. And then we take them and photograph them. And we'll talk a little bit about how we do that. This is an Io moth, a male. So it's got the yellow forewings. And the picture on the left is one that I took just what we call in situ on our back porch, on our stucco wall with a close focusing 35mm camera and a single flash. And you can see that the stucco is kind of shiny, and there's a little shadow here and there, and the colors are kind of muddy. So it isn't really the best photograph. So what we do is we'll catch it, cool it in the refrigerator, and then we'll take it in a room we have that has this, what's called a white box in the upper right. And this white box was actually designed by Dr. John Abbott. I don't know if you know John. He used to be at UT. He's now at University of Alabama. And how it works is it's a box that holds 4 different flashes that are synchronized to a transmitter on your camera. And so when you press the shutter, all of the flashes, which are on the sides, the top, will flash at the same time, and they'll eliminate all of the shadow, and they'll light the object uniformly. And if you put a black background there, it looks just like the dead of night. So the picture on the right is a picture of the Io moth taken with that kind of procedure. So just to show you a little bit more about what kind of moth pictures you can get, this again is the Cecropia moth, and we mentioned that they're fairly large. You can see the inset shows how big they are. They're actually sitting on my hand. These are part of the silk moths who have no mouth parts, and these adults do not feed as adults. But boy, their caterpillars sure do.
Yeah,
They're
they make up
large.
for it.
And these were all taken in the white box. This is the Promethea silk moth, the Polyphemus moth, which has a cousin out in West Texas called the Oculea moth, very similar looking. The regal moth, and this was taken in the white box without any background at all, so you can see it's perfectly white. This technique is actually used to take pictures of products for sale online. Amazon uses it, for example. Here's a Coletta silk moth that uses Senizo. The Forbes silk moth, which is a rare moth in South Texas, and those kind of triangular shaped light green patches are actually translucent windows in the wings. Really beautiful. A Rocky Mountain agapima, which is a West Texas moth. The imperial moth, which we have around here in Central Texas. And of course, the Luna moth. I think most people are familiar with the Luna moth. All right, so that's what we had for you. Do you have any questions? We have on this page, just in case you're interested, if you want to contact us, you can contact us at naturewatch@austin.rr.com. Our blog is at naturewatchaustin.blogspot.com. And we have in the works our 5th nature book, which is entitled Naturalist Austin, A Guide to the Flora and Fauna of Central Texas. And it will include almost 700 species of plants and animals, rare ones, endemic ones, as well as common ones. And that hopefully will be out next year.
Yeah, we're hopeful.
I can speak.
It's a process, though.
Hi, this is Leon at the Ty Preston Library. When you were mentioning the host trees, for example, do moths have a preference for those trees that are, separately male and female, or it doesn't really matter? For example, the ash juniper.
I don't think they care. That's an interesting question, but I don't think the chemistry of the leaves is different enough for them to care.
The only time I would think it would happen, and I cannot think of an example, but our knowledge is not exhaustive.
For sure.
Is if a flower was different on a female, or
if it was a seed head eater or something,
Right.
that didn't occur on the male version.
Right. But I can't think
of an example.
most things that we looked at when they utilized trees, they did eat the leaves, and the leaves are not different.
Thank
But
you.
there could be an example of that. I'm
Well,
just not aware of it.
yeah. We didn't come across one. Interesting question, though.
Craig, I was just curious, how did you shortlist, since there are thousands of, how did you shortlist the butterflies and moths?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question too. And it was a struggle. We spent probably more time massaging that list than in creating the book by a long shot. It's any other person doing it, or even us doing it again, I'm sure would come up with a different list, because you just can't do everything. There are so many different choices, but we just tried to get a variety of plants that were across the state, variety of types of plants and types of moths and butterflies, so that we covered a good cross section, and try to get some things that were common, as well as some things that maybe weren't so common but were interesting.
The other point I would make is that there was an exhaustive effort to validate the associations of what a moth ate or what a butterfly ate across at least 4 or 5 resources.
Yeah.
So we were absolutely sure, if we hadn't witnessed it ourselves, that this was an association that was valid. And we haven't gotten any
Yeah, we haven't gotten any criticism
No.
for
that.
for that for that part of it.
But it was not an easy task.
Yeah, it was not easy. It took a lot of time,
Yeah.
and yeah, you could make these things into a humongous volume if you tried to really cover everything. So we did have to cull it.